Van Dyke Show, starring Dick Van Dyke.
I was asked to do situation comedy after the advent and the death of variety shows. The shows was on for, and Caesar's out for 9 years, and then all of a sudden situation comedies were the tool. And I was being offered things that weren't terribly good. They were copies of things that existed. And I said, I don't know what to do with this. And my wife said, why don't you write one? And I said, well, I don't know how to do that. And so I did what everybody who has been successful doing situation comedies, really successful, base it on their own understanding of where they are and who they are. So I wrote a thing based on my experience with the show of shows, being a writer, actor / mainly actor on the show of shows, and living in New Rochelle and having children. So in a revelatory moment, going on the East Side Drive, I said, where do I stand? What piece of ground do I stand that nobody else stands on? New Rochelle, right uptown. I came up with the idea for a thing called Head of the Family. And I did a pilot, didn't work, and I said, that's it. I wrote 13 episodes, knowing that if I acted in it, I had to be sure that I had material for other writers to say, what's it like? Oh, well, this is the Bible, these 13 Anyway, it laid around for a year, and I said, I was furious, because I knew it was good stuff. It was based on my life, and it was sort of funny. And didn't sell until a year later. Somebody said they'd like to do it again. Sheldon Leonard was talked to by my agent, Harry Kalsham, and I said, I don't want to fail with the same thing as you. We won't fail. He said, we'll get you somebody better than you to play you, and he did.
Well, are you going to tell me?
Laura Petrie, when I started, was myself, and then when we put the, I tailored that for myself, and then we had a guy named Dick Van Dyke who was not a Bronx Jew, he was a Midwestern Gentile. However, without changing anything, it just changed because it was in his mouth and he processed it through his body and his ethic and morality, which was very similar. It was the Judeo-Christian mentality, and it was no problem. We did gear to the fact that he looked a little different, but we didn't. I never made any ethnic jokes originally, so I didn't have to do a lot. But it filtered through him so well. I mean, it was a wonderful fit. Jewish comics were not big at the time. There were a lot of great Jewish comedians on the air, but they were not necessarily playing Jews. Benny Kubelski, Jack Benny was playing Jack Benny, not Benny Kubelski. Nathan Birbaum was playing George Burns. I pointed to him, he's sitting on that corner over there. There's a poster of him in Oh God in my office, and that's what I was looking at. But they weren't ostensibly playing Jewish people. They were playing humans, Americans. And Dick Van Dyke had a checkered career before he came to us. He'd done a lot of things. He'd been 10 pilots before he did the Dick Van Dyke pilot. However, he had starred on Broadway in Bye Bye Birdie, and that was the beginning of his renown. In a 5-year period, seeing him for 158 shows, he was the most creative, wonderful guy to work with. And if things didn't work, he'd find a way to make them work or question you in the right way and he'd make you make it better. And it never gave us no temperament. I mean, he was a very compliant guy, and yet he got his way by doing things so well that you couldn't argue with him. You say, wait, that's better than what I had in mind.
My first time on the jury.
It was important in the Dick Van Dyke Show for Dick's sanity, not sanity so much as pleasure. He loved doing pantomime. So in every 4th, 5th show, I made sure that there was some pantomimic moments that he would just enjoy. I remember one we said, hey, we're going to give you a whole pantomime. You're up in a mountain alone in a cabin writing. We have to fill in a guy who's lost his muse. And most writers have that. They'd rather sharpen pencils than get to work. Well, he did like 35 variations of wasting times. He's got a body that does things that most people would love to do. the casting of Laura was the most difficult of all. When I had cast the pilot that I did in New York, I had the same problem. I was looking for somebody, I don't know what I was looking for, and I did find a girl named Barbara Britton. And now that and that pilot didn't sell, and now when I was going to do it again, I said, oh my God, I can go through all the people I went through before. None of them seemed right with Dick. It was seeing wonderful actors, just didn't seem right. And one of these lucky happenstances, after about 30 or 40 people in 2 days, I said to Sheldon, I don't know what I'm looking for. He says, you will when you find her, when you hear her. And it happened. She walked in the office, Mary did, being depressed about going on a couple of auditions lately and striking out, and she wasn't even going to go to this one. And she came and read the first line on the page, and it was a simple line like, hello, darling, or something, just, and I heard a ping in her voice. That's the way I've described it, and a brightness about her, and she was, naturally beautiful. You couldn't deny her beauty. And I stopped her. I went with my hand like the claw in that machine that you see at the boardwalk. It picks up things. I went with my hand as a claw and I put it on top of her head. She got scared. She thought I was going to attack her. And I said, come with me, young lady. And I never left the top of her head. I walked her down the hall holding the top of her head. And she knew it was funny. And I said, I want you to meet Sheldon Leonard, our executive producer. And I said, I got her. Here she is. I still had it, like I wouldn't let go, the machine would drop her and she'd run away.
I'd had a particularly bad week where I was turned down for every role that I interviewed for. And I just got to feeling very petulant and sorry for myself and said, no, I don't want to go. And then they told me it was to be with Carl Reiner. And I had had a crush on him forever from your show of shows and the Sid Caesar show. And I went in and I read with him. And he just put the pages down after a half a page of dialogue, and he said, come with me. He put his hand on the top of my head and using it like a rudder, steered me down the hall and around the corner to Sheldon Leonard's office, where he said, listen to this. And I read again with him, and they made up their minds right then and there without actually saying anything to me. But I knew I had the job, I knew it. And sure enough, the next morning, I got a call from my agent saying, you're Dick Van Dyke's wife.
Once we got married Tyler Moore, we knew who Laura was. Actually, but they're all based, all the situations are based on things I either lived through, knew about, or tickled by.
If I had been in Carl Reiner's shoes and this little 23-year-old punk started talking about honesty, I would have given her short shrift, but not Carl. He took me to be a serious woman, and he has actually said that I made him a better writer, that I forced him to on the rare occasion when there would be a character conflict for me, because it got a laugh, he would eventually demur and say, okay, we won't go for that joke. You're right, Mary, it's inconsistent.
It's the foreground of any situation comedy that makes the success. And the background keeps it successful. The background meaning the writing and everything else that happens. But if you don't like the people, you're not going to... conversely, you can love the people sometimes and say, why did they put them in that direct? I mean, that happens too.
The words that were put in our mouths were from Carl Reiner and a couple of other writers who were all geniuses. And they made us lovable and likable and funny.
Writers are performers who don't particularly like to perform. They perform with but then they can illustrate what they've done, usually better than the comedian sometimes can do it. But they don't want to get out there. And there are a number of those writers that I know that are funnier than anybody, but they don't particularly want to get out there. Mel Brooks is not one of those people. But Mel Brooks was a writer on the show of shows for years, and but he was always the funniest one, even then. The idea of a writer being the star of a situation comedy was new and also fought against by the head of the network. He said when he saw the pilot, he said, very good, very good. He said, but wouldn't it be better if he did something that everybody could understand and identify with, like, for instance, an accountant or I says, yeah, sure, we can make him an accountant, and then we'll talk numbers in the office. I said, don't you realize what we're doing? He's working. He's a working man and having all the problems of a working man, but when he's in the office, he's making jokes because that's what they do for a living, and we can do bad, good jokes. If it's a bad joke, we'll say, don't put it in. I was an accountant, it would have to be a funny accountant. And I said, there was only one. That was, at the time, it was Bob Newhart.
One more joke and we can call it a week.
Yeah, one more week joke, we can call it a month.
No, seriously, if we write one more joke, we can come in late Monday.
It took a bright critic. Sometimes we make fun of critics, but every once in a while a critic comes up with something. They notice that this is the first show where a guy comes home and says, honey, I'm home, and they know where he came from. And I realized that, because I was paraphrasing my own life, half my life, when I went home, I talked about The Office. I talked about what happened with Sid and Howard and Nanette and Imogene Coca. And when we went to The Office, we talked about our wives and kids. So that's what the show was about. It was about what I was experiencing living in New Rochelle and working downtown. And so no other show had done that before that I knew of. Father Knows Best came home. We didn't know what he did. I think he was an insurance salesman. I'm not sure. And Ozzy, we didn't know what. He just came home. And most shows, Danny Thomas, you knew he was a nightclub performer, and every once in a while you go to the nightclub. But for the most part, it was homebound. A lot of the shows were Battle of Sexes. Not Ozzy and Harriet, that was very sweet. But most of them, and this was two against the world rather than two against each other. It was really based on how I felt about my wife. We were not able to deal with how people really feel about each other, married couples who love each other. We were constrained to use twin beds rather than double beds, but you knew there was a connection, a sexual connection with these two people. We allowed it to happen. We didn't go around saying, I love you ever, because I never believed that's a shorthand way of, you have to prove by behavior that you love somebody and the way you react to each other's needs. There's no way of knowing that it's going to work, and that's chemistry. Even people who get married don't realize it until a few years later that, hey, it's not working or it is working. But the chemistry worked. Dick and Mary really liked each other. They even talked about that. They had real feelings for nothing. They never acted on their emotional interest in each other. The Petries became the quintessential nuclear family just because they were reflecting that age group in that time. And it didn't hurt that one show we did, I can't remember, it was something about an old writer who sells Mary a tie and remembers, and he mentions the fact that she looked like Mrs. Kennedy. And people picked up on that, and they said they were like the Kennedys of the situation. It was Rob and Laura, and it was Mr. and Mrs. JFK. Well, the show reveals that the mores have changed. Some of the things remain constant. There are shows that we did where today's world, both members of the family have to work in many instances. And we did a couple of shows where Mary went to work in the office once and went to work as a dancer, a fill-in dancer, and she was so tired at the end. She was so happy not to have to do that. I mean, I'm embarrassed when I look at that show because women's roles have changed since then. Mainly, most of the things work as far as the relationship between husband and wife. That hasn't changed much. Oh, the morality has changed completely. I mean, what we were allowed to say and do then, I mean, when I see certain things, I said, my God, if I had said that, I would have been pilloried. I mean, we would have been thrown off the air. And I don't object to the use of any subject, anything, sex, whatever, if it's used because you need it, not because you want to hype the moment. In other words, you're doing something that's not working. If you drop your pants, it works for that moment, and then you put your pants up and the show's still not working. No, the essence has to be correct.
That's pretty bad.
Rosemarie was a star at 6. Her background and history is so amazing. It's the history of vaudeville, the history of early radio.
I'm gonna love you like nobody's loved you, come rain or come shine.
And so she was known for a long time, but at this point she was now working in episodic television. She had been on tour singing in clubs, but she was needing a little boost in her career, and that gave it to her. And it really helped us. Every time you watch Rosie perform, you say, boy, does she know what she's doing. She never let us down.
Where's Laura?
She's at the Smithsonian Institute. They're making a statue of her mouth.
Maury Amsterdam was Rosie's idea, and I never could thank her enough for it. He came to work in doing something he had never done before, a series. He had done series, as a matter of fact, the original Tonight Show. There was a show called Broadway Open House before that, where he did ostensibly that kind of thing. And Art Carney was his sidekick. And so he had been exposed to television before, but he had never done an acting role, and this was new to him. And boy, did he fall into that and love it. I mean, he came to work happy every day. He brought with him 100 billion jokes, and we would sit around the table and say, couldn't eat a line here, but he can't. And if he gave a line and you looked and it wasn't good, he says, or, and he gives another line, and it was invaluable that way. In writing good situation comedy, as far as I'm concerned, don't look for the joke, look for the situation that will lend itself to humor. And sometimes a good joke interrupts a train of thought. You know when people are doing what I call curving every line, so that every line is seemingly funny. But when you go straight with sensible thoughts, a comedic person will always be able to turn it and quip it that way. So I don't like one-line jokes. It gets boring and it really doesn't go very far. And those shows don't go very far, ultimately.
So much of what I learned in those days is far as structure. See, a lot of the shows didn't care about structure or story. They only cared about jokes. But Carl was a bug on making sense, so all the structural things that I learned helped me on Happy Days and Vern Shirley and Mork and Mindy even. As crazy as Mork and Mindy was, I would always say, you have to have some structure. It can't be a man just jumping around. They follow a story. Carl said they sit home, they follow a story. If you don't give them one, they'll laugh, but they may not tune in. They follow a story, they'll like the people.
But basing things on something that happened to you, I would always say to writers, when they came in with ideas, as before you give us, not before, if they came up dry, I would say, instead of that, what happened to you lately? Anything happened in your family lately, to your wife, your kids, your partners, anything, just something, an incident that happened.
Let me see.
Why don't you give me the baby?
No, honey. Look, you take the bait.
And if they could come up with an incident that had a nub of humor in it, we'd develop it. Things that happen to people make for the best shows, and things that happen in your mind make for Twilight Zone. Oh, Jerry Melson and Gary Marshall, they were a delight. When you're doing a series, you need help. And the first 2 years, I didn't have a lot of help. I did 40 of the first 60 shows myself and was my own story editor, and there was no producer but me. Today, I love the fact that there are 57 different producers' names on it. It's the guy who brought the coffee. He gets to be a coffee producer. I don't know what it is, but it's pretty silly.
The Dick Van Dyke Show is our favorite show, but Carl Reiner didn't want us to write for it because he thought we were joke meisters. We were big joke guys writing for most of the comics. And the Dick Van Dyke Show did stories, and they did what they call realies, real life, comedically looked at. So it took a minute, but Sheldon Leonard, who knew us from other shows, put in a good word, and his two top writers, Persky and Danoff, Bill Persky and Danoff, were friends of ours from New York. We all came to Hollywood together, and we had helped them get on the Joey Bishop show, so they were going to help us on the Van Dyke Show. So with so much pressure, Carl said, oh, I'll see those two guys. So we went in and met them, and we became friends, we auditioned, we wrote stuff, and then his son married my sister, and look at the circles of life.
Belson and Marshall, we always had to temper their things. You know, everything has to go through the sieve of the original. In my case, it was me because I was there. It would get so wild and crazy. They had wonderful wild and crazy things, and we used them all, but I said, but we have to make sure it's our people being wild and crazy, not just, everybody's got a different reality, and it's up to somebody who knows what the original reality is.
Carl Reiner, to me, was, you know, one of the first geniuses at doing a show every week. A lot of people could be funny for once or twice, but Carl rolled it out every week for years, and that was pretty hard to do. And he learned, I'm sure, from the Sid Caesar days, he learned what comedy was, and he took the sketch comedy and made it more real so it could go into people's living rooms and the people could relate to it as their own life. So he was very special, you know, and everybody thought, well, we would do jokes, we were all funny guys. But mostly Carl would make us sit around. You know, there weren't many writers on that show. And maybe 6 was most of the group that did most of the shows. And the 6 of us would sit around, just tell embarrassing moments, terrible experiences we had. And that's what became shows, you know. And he was very, he had worked with Doc Simon on the Show of Shows, and he knew that the loudest person, like Mel Brooks, was not always the funniest person on a given day. So Carl learned to listen to the loud guys and then take a minute and listen to the quiet guys, which I was one of the quiet guys at the time. And he said, Gary, tell me something about yourself. And we would tell embarrassing moments. I think one of the award-winning shows was I, growing up, I had moles on my back. And my mother, who had a sense of humor, said if I took a pencil and connect all the moles on your back, I'd get a picture. Well, that embarrassed me as a 10-year-old, but years later, I was telling Carl that story, and that became an episode of Dick Van Dyke getting the moles on his back connected.
Working at the Desilu studios was like going to a party, because on the lot were friends doing other shows, and over at the other end of the lot was Andy Griffith. Aaron Rubin was doing the Andy Griffith show. And he was a friend from the Show of Shows days, from the Caesar's Hours days. And Sheldon and Danny Thomas were next door to us. We were on stage 8, they were on stage 9. So you always felt like you can go borrow a cup of gags if you need. You didn't, but the lunchroom on the thing was a place to have fun because you'd always see guys from the other shows. Hey, what are you doing today? What do you know? It was a very home-like place. There was small buildings, no lavish offices, so that everybody felt like they were, you know, in a neighborhood. It was a neighborhood.
Carl Reiner, to most all of us on that show, was not only a creative force in the writing of the characters, but he was a force in the demeanor on the set. He demanded honesty. There was no pushing anything under the carpet. If there was a problem of some sort on the set or a disagreement about how a scene should be played, you know, he would just say, okay, let's put it out here on this table and let's go at it. Let's figure it and solve it and be on to something new. He really made us satisfied with only the truth.
To produce the show, we lucked out with a schedule that I actually gave to Norman Lear as a present when he told me he's doing All in the Family. I said, I'm going to give you a present you're never going to forget. And here's the present. It's the schedule. And he says, a lot of people won't like it, but you're going to love it. I said, you shoot the show on a Tuesday night. On Wednesday, you get around the table and read the show coming up and the following week's show. The following week's show so the writer and producer can hear what's missing and take it to work. The one you're doing this week, you'll work on this week. So you're working Wednesday around the table, put it on its feet Wednesday afternoon, start blocking the scenes. Thursday, the same thing. Friday, it's all blocked out. You bring the producer, myself and other people down to, we look at the run-through without cameras. We look at the run-through. The cameramen will be there, but they don't do anything. And then we repair we sit around after and say what worked, what didn't work. We all have notes.
I don't think the jigsaw puzzle here works because it looks like you're not terribly concerned about the problem he's creating. So.
Yeah, we had it in the other script in the first version, and it doesn't pay off.
Yeah, it's just a matter of intensifying the problem, and I think we can do it better by concentrating.
Right.
Okay.
We don't even mention it anymore anyway.
No.
Okay, we'll get rid of the puzzle.
Now the things that most people don't like, but I did because it was my show, I said, so I have Saturday and Sunday to do all the rewrites of the show. And if it's a lot of rewrites, I'll finish it by Sunday and have it in the people's houses Sunday night so they can look it over. Monday morning, the cameras come in. We block the show for cameras on Monday morning, all day Monday, and have a run-through on Monday night. The camera blocking is slow. So any big changes they had, they can learn them as they're blocking because they stop, they go, and they're learning on Monday. That's the dress rehearsal, Monday night. We see the show. Make any little changes around the table after the show and say, may change this, this, and then on Tuesday, you have the show, you reblock it again during the day, and then shoot it with an audience at 7 o'clock. And so you've had 7 days on each show. If you started on a Monday and finished on a Friday, those 2 days they'd be for fun and going to movies. But in my case, I told my wife when I had the schedule, I said, give me 2 years, honey, we'll have a hit. Because I worked Saturday and Sunday. I was alone and I did all the rewrites on Saturday and Sunday. And the new shows, I'd be writing during the week. So, but the guy gave us 7 days. And a lot of shows are using that today.
The writers went and worked in a writer place, and Carl and Sheldon Leonard and a few of the other writers would come down to watch us rehearse and put on its feet the various scenes that were going to be a part of that week's show. And they would make comments, oh, let's try this, or we think we need to go back and rewrite something here and there. And always, always open to anybody's suggestion. If the guy who did the coffee and donuts in the morning had a good idea, Carl Reiner would use it.
In rehearsals, there would be the natural improvisation that always happens in rehearsal with good actors. They will find pieces of business that you didn't outline, or they will find a way to do a line or suggest another line, and you ostensibly, all the actors had leave to improvise if they come up. They knew the difference. They knew when they had something good, they'd do it. And if they didn't have something good, they would try something. And if it worked, fine. If it didn't work, that's what the run-throughs were about. I don't know how anything affects anything, because when you're doing your thing, you're not thinking about, well, how will this affect, or will I be known as the effector of things? But looking back and reading people, after I finished the Dick Van Dyke Show, somebody noticed that, that's the first show, as I said, that has a home life and a work life. And now when they did Mary, the Mary Tyler Moore show, the same thing held true. They didn't give her a husband, which was smart, but they did know where she lived and what her problems were at home. She had a whole house full of people there. She had Cloris Leachman and Rhoda, Valerie Harper, and coming in and out, and her boyfriends would come in and out of that house. So you had two sides of a person's life, the work life and the home life. And it seemed that became something that happened a few times after that, but that was the basic accidental contribution. I think naturally, if you have an ethic about you, everything you do, if it doesn't have a moral, it has a message that you don't even know, a subliminal message. You don't, because if it doesn't, then it's about nothing. A natural moral evolves. I was aware that morals were happening, and that I guess we grew up on Aesop's fables. We grew up on stories that had little morals, and that was my time. And so in my head, that's inculcated in your thinking.
Carl happens to be a very upstanding, moral, sensitive, considerate human being, and so it always showed up in the writing. That is, assuming he's writing for the lead people in his series. If he's writing for Mel Cooley, Richard Deacon, or Alan Brady himself, then, you know, he would try to put a lid on all his good instincts.
I'm decent, so why shouldn't the Petries be decent? And I think most people on television, most shows on television are about decent people. You wouldn't want to see it otherwise. However, you have to have protagonists, or antagonists rather, otherwise the decent people wouldn't look decent. You wouldn't know they were decent unless they had to butt up against something that was indecent. You keep looking for things that you haven't done. And by the end of 5 years, you've practically done everything. And we opted to leave after that. But we never looked for, we looked every week for something that hadn't been done before, that we hadn't done before, and possibly something that nobody had done before. And that's the things that thrilled us when we'd find one of those. But you never went to say, what are we going to do different this year that we did last? Never think of that. You think in terms of taking one step after another. I think it had lasting appeal because the as I call it, the foreground, the actors had lasting appeal. It's a pleasure to see those people. Every once in a while I tune it on at 9 in the morning and I see two dancers. I mean, they were dancers, that's another thing. They had the grace of dancers and they're a pleasure to look at. And what they're saying and doing is rather palatable. And that makes it last. If the material that these two people are doing, these people you love to watch doing, if they're doing something that's worth doing, it lasts longer. Just look at Astaire and Rogers. There isn't a moment in any of their dances when you turn it on. It's black and white. It's old-fashioned. They're wearing tuxedo, but you watch it because you like those two people and they're doing something that makes sense. And I think that's what it is. The show, for the most part, made sense. It wasn't, when it was silly, it was funny, silly, but it was people who knew they were being silly, being silly.
Harmony, harmony.
Knowing what I know now, would I have changed anything? Not a thing. I mean, regrets about how you live your life is the worst thing you can have. And even the things that don't work out are learning processes. I think everything you do in every era that you work, you learn something. And as a matter of fact, I'm writing a book now. I don't think I could have written it 20 years ago because everything, it's like building a brick wall. The wall keeps getting bigger and bigger, and you learn how to put the bricks on, and you learn as you go. Earn while you learn is what I learned. And there's no way of learning something without having done it. You can't tell anybody what you've done and how to do it. You can't instruct. It's the doing it yourself that makes you understand. Ultimately, you may not even understand it. It's a natural process that happens in the head. It just sorts out what's, you go, well, what are you talking about? And your head tells you that immediately. But it's because you've had the experience.